Hello and welcome to Within the Frame. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Han Da-eun. South Korea's economy grew at the fastest pace in over 2 years in the first quarter of this year, beating market expectations and catching the whole world by surprise. The OECD has sharply revised up Korea's growth forecast for this year to 2.6%, projecting robust recovery in exports, consumer spending, and investment. But some economists urge caution, pointing out that the country still faces a series of headwinds. For an accurate diagnosis of the Korean economy and some insights into necessary policy measures, we now invite Kim Sei-wan, professor of economics at Ewha Womans University, to the program. It's always great to see you.
Thank you for having me today.
Also with us tonight is Daniel Moss, Bloomberg Opinion Columnist, who writes about Asian economies. It's a pleasure to have you with us on our show.
Good to be here.
All right, Daniel, let's kick things off with you. In your recent column published in Bloomberg, you mentioned that there is much more to the South Korean economy than its cultural exports that deserves more attention. Could you elaborate on the driving forces that led what you refer to as the surprise South Korean boom?
So it was surprising on many levels. Not only did it beat expectations in the first quarter, as you indicated, it beat them very handily. Year-on-year growth was 3.4%. The consensus was for around 2.5%. That's a big beat by anyone's language. But as I thought about this, I thought South Korea's economy can't get a lot of respect. It's one of the world's biggest, ranked number 10 according to some surveys. It's an export powerhouse. Yet when many people think about Korean exports, lately they've been thinking of popular culture, the success of Korean soaps, the success of Korean bands. You can't swing a cat in Singapore these days, where I live, without hitting a Korean restaurant. It's everywhere. But really, the stuff Korea makes and that the world seeks from it, the building blocks of the contemporary world economy. And there's a lot of focus on China's economy. There's enormous focus on the US economy and the Federal Reserve. Korea's economy really should get more attention than it is now receiving. And that was one of the points that I wanted to make when I wrote that column.
In your op-ed, you also mentioned that President Yoon should get some credit for undertaking bold policies which have contributed to Korea's export recovery and furthermore national growth. But the achievement is yet to be felt by average citizens, which partly explains the election results. And we'll discuss this in a bit. But before that, Dr. Kim, South Korea saw surprisingly strong first quarter growth, with the country logging a current account surplus of over $16.8 billion. Would you say that Korea is now on a solid path to recovery?
As Mr. Moss pointed out, the first quarter's 1.3% growth on quarter was a good surprise. And we can carefully expect that Korean economy is turning over and the recovery is on its way for this year. In the first quarter, Korean export did well as expected, and in addition, domestic construction expanded unexpectedly. Another good sign is that domestic consumption, which is the largest part of the GDP, increased by 0.4% in the first quarter. But at the same time, retail sales, which is another indicator of domestic consumption, declined by 2.7% on year in March, which is a negative sign for the future of Korean economy. However, overall, Korean economy will grow faster than expected early this year due to strong rise in chip export and recovering domestic consumption, particularly when interest rate is cut in the second half of this year. Investment and domestic consumption together would be seriously recovered, and it could be another momentum of economic recovery.
So we're clearly seeing an uptick in exports, and as you mentioned, we saw stronger than expected growth in the property sector, in the real estate sector, and also the retail sector. The consumer prices also fell below the 3% range for the first time last month, and hopes are high that we'll see a strong economic recovery. Many economists also predict domestic spending to also recover significantly in the latter half of this year. So we'll see if Korea will be able to hit higher annual growth this year, as many think tanks and global institutions project. But Dr. Kim, the problem is, though, that Korea's stronger than expected growth is not being felt by ordinary citizens, as I mentioned at the top. This has prompted President Yoon to call for measures that can help citizens reap the benefits of Korea's economic recovery. What underlies the discrepancy between robust data and citizens' economic struggles?
I think that is because inflation is still hovering around 3% on year, and recovery is not widespread over all industries and all regions, which means recovery is focused on only several industries like chips and automobiles. Particularly general citizens do not feel stabilized inflation because of skyrocketing agricultural product prices. Particularly in April last month, the prices of fruits increased by 38% on year, and vegetables price increased by 13% on year. And businesses in retail sales, restaurants and hotels are declining in a large scale, over 5% on year in the same month. So I think it would take 1 or 2 quarters more to see an all industry-wide recovery.
Well, high exchange rate, interest rates that are relatively lower than other major economies are working in favor of Korea's exports, but it seems it's not quite the case for average citizens. And as you mentioned, it takes time for the strong data and its benefits to be reflected elsewhere across the country. Also, the citizens, they saw one of the most intense foodflations in the past few months. So there is continuing public frustration with the high costs. Now, Dr. Daniel, Korea's inflation remains sticky, as Dr. Kim said, and the continual depreciation of the Korean won against the dollar is worrying the Bank of Korea. Give us your analysis of the headwinds currently facing the Korean economy. We appear to be experiencing a technical glitch. We are not getting the sound of Daniel. Daniel,
yes, the technical glitch was all mine, I'm afraid. I was muted. The point I was going to convey is few things are ever totally good. You know, one of the flip sides of a re-accelerating economy is that interest rates are probably not going to come down as fast as predicted. So if you go back 12 months ago, people were talking about a pronounced slowdown in the Korean economy as a result of relatively rapid interest rate increases we saw from around mid-2021. Bank of Korea, one of the first in the industrial world to begin raising rates, significantly earlier than the Fed and others. So folks might have been hoping for some relief. Inflation's not coming down quite as people had anticipated, and the stickiness of inflation in the United States has led to a surprising rally in the US dollar this year. If you put that together, that makes it pretty hard for the Bank of Korea to lower interest rates anytime soon. They have a meeting coming up. The message is likely to be reiterated that, hey, we want to get there, it's just a little too soon.
So Korea will continue to see high inflation and high interest rates, at least for the time being. Now, from a long-term perspective, Daniel, some economists say that the Korean economy's traditional growth drivers of manufacturing and large conglomerates are showing signs of running out of steam. We want to get your thoughts on this.
Well, I certainly wouldn't pronounce last rites on the Korean growth model. What is apparent, if you go back over the decades, South Korea has gone from very high rates of growth in the 70s, 80s, and for much of the 90s, pre-1997, 1998. There was a bounce from there, but it's never gone back to that level, and that's fine. You know, when I talk to officials in Southeast Asia and the demographic dividend, they say, well, we should have done, or we should do what South Korea did. That is, take those years of very high growth when there were a lot of entrants into the labor market and use that to boost education and manufacturing skills that can get us to the upper income level. Now, people outside Korea feel that Korea made a good job of that. So, you know, the decades of, 6, 7, 8% annual growth as a typical thing are probably gone, but the economy's much bigger now. 2, 3%. These are pretty good years in the United States, the Eurozone, or the UK. Korea is an advanced economy now. It's one of the largest in the world. Get used to it.
Well, calls have been growing here in Korea that we need to find new growth engines that can be more resilient to external uncertainties. And along with that, Korea also has a pile of urgent issues that need to be resolved to keep the economy going, such as tackling shrinking working population. This is certainly a question that needs one whole hour of intense discussions, but thank you for that concise analysis. Now, moving on to our next question, Dr. Kim. Next week, the Bank of Korea will hold the final rate-setting meeting of the first half of this year. Do you expect another rate freeze, and how do you gauge the impact on domestic spending?
I think Bank of Korea will leave the base interest rate at current level of 3.5% next week. It looks that U.S. interest rate cut is more likely to be delayed thanks to sticky inflation in U.S. And U.S. economy is experiencing well over 3% inflation from last year. And Bank of Korea is expected to cut its rate after seeing U.S. Fed's interest rate cut to avoid further Korean won depreciation from higher interest rate gap between Korea and United States. As of now, the two countries' base interest rate gap is 2%. If Bank of Korea cuts its base rate, that depreciates Korean won further and drives up domestic price level. However, Bank of Korea can't let domestic economy get worse forever with higher interest rate. So before domestic economy loses its recovery momentum, there is a possibility that Bank of Korea can cut its rate in the second half of this year without U.S. Fed interest rate cut.
So the BOK there is a possibility that the BOK they may begin to cut rates in the latter half of this year, and this regardless of the U.S. Fed's decision. Now, here's a question for you both. President Yoon, marking 2 years in office, has vowed to focus on revamping people's livelihoods in the remainder of his term. What are the urgent tasks, and what policies are needed to address them? Daniel, let's first hear your thoughts.
Well, a lot of these touchy-feely noises that are coming out of the Blue House probably need to be seen in the context of a thorough election drubbing, to use a term George W. Bush once used, a shellacking. So we're certainly seeing a rhetorical commitment to focusing on bread and butter concerns, kitchen table concerns. One thing that is very interesting to me is the president has talked about establishing a ministry whose primary focus will be on lifting the birth rate, lifting the fertility rate. Many countries, certainly many prosperous countries through Asia, face the problem of low and getting lower fertility rates. This is the first time I've seen talk of a specific ministry devoted to that task. It will be intriguing to see how that progresses, and maybe some other countries, rich countries in Asia, that are suffering from low birth rates, whether that is a model, talk about the Korean model, that they can adapt.
And Dr. Kim, we also want to get your thoughts on this.
Yes, I actually pretty much agree with Mr. Mo's suggestion on Korean economic policies. Since Korean people are aging fast, it is important to prepare for structural changes in the labor market, financial market, and economic growth. In this respect, I'm glad to see that President Yoon has decided to have a Department of Low Fertility Response and presidential staff on this matter. And regarding continuing high prices in agricultural products, it would be great to import agricultural products from other countries to stabilize inflation and people's living costs. Of course, there could be some political pressure, like from farmers group, if Korean government decided to import fruits. But I think it is time to exercise the art of persuasion for stabilizing, for lessening people's pain from the high inflation.
Well, President Yoon has revived the Presidential Office for Civil Affairs, aiming to better capture the voices of the people and address their needs, while also resuming town hall meetings to hold direct talks with the citizens. So hopefully all the efforts will lead to some tangible results perceptible to the public. And since we have a bit more time left, Dr. Kim, how would you grade the Yoon administration's economic policies and achievements in the first 2 years?
Well, it looks to me the first 2 years under President Yoon was a difficult years. There were quite a few uncontrollable external shocks from the war in European countries and in Arabian countries. So we had a series of the shock of the higher oil price and higher agricultural products price and international seizing in transportation and so on. But along with that, there were quite a few problems inside of the Korean economy, like social conflicts between different groups. And there was not much progress in reconstructing Korean education system and labor market system and so on. And I think after 2 years of that difficult times, it is time to shift up and gearing up the progress of the Korean economy by having more close relationship and conversation with related people. So I think President Yoon's press conference with media is a good gesture to do that.
And Daniel, you write for Bloomberg. You write about the Asian economies, and since we have a bit more time left, and it's been a while since we looked into the details of how China's economy is faring, we want to get your thoughts on the current state of the Chinese economy. Some scholars say that China's economy is headed for a dead end. What are your thoughts?
I would never underestimate the Chinese economy when one looks at the enormous progress and, for a while, fairly stratospheric levels of growth that we've seen in recent decades. Now, those levels of growth have come down significantly. You're probably looking at a projection whereby in the next 10 to 15 years, China's growth rate, slows to about 2 or 3%. Again, a good year in the US or the Eurozone. One of the really tricky challenges that China has right now is inflation is just too low. Sounds strange when we talk about South Korea and the United States, where inflation is uncomfortably high for authorities. In China, it is uncomfortably low. We had quite a few months in the second half of last year where prices were falling. Now they're the right side of zero, but barely. Here's the thing, though. The central bank doesn't seem inclined to take dramatic steps to turn this around. So we're probably looking, unless something changes, at a fairly prolonged period of anemic price increases at best. And this divergence between China and the rest of the world will be something to watch. Does that become more magnified? And if so, what are the consequences of that?
Well, China certainly is one of Korea's most important strategically and economically important partner nations, and exports to China have been falling significantly here in Korea. So developments in China we will certainly be keeping very close tabs on, but we'll leave things there for tonight. Thank you so much, Daniel and Professor Kim, for your in-depth analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.